Good evening. My name is Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood. I am here this evening to talk to you about a friend of mine, a spiritual advisee of mine on Oklahoma's death row named Scott Eizember. Scott committed a number of crimes, pretty awful situation to be quite frank, that led to him being tried for murder. After he was convicted, the jury took up the question of whether or not he should get the death penalty. Well, here in the United States, juries that decide a death penalty case are required to be free of attitudes that would prevent or substantially impair their ability to decide a sentence fairly. You see, what that means is that a jury must be prepared to offer the sentences that are allowed by law. Meaning that a jury that is impaneled in a death penalty case has to be able to consider the death penalty, which ultimately leads to this designation that a jury is death qualified. Well, along the same lines, what should also be the case is that if the law requires a death qualified jury, it should also require a life qualified jury. And what I'm saying is if a jury that's been impaneled has to be able to mentally the jurors have to be able to mentally consider the death penalty, then so too should they have to be able to mentally consider a life sentence, even in the most heinous of circumstances. This standard was set out in Wainwright versus Witt in 1985 by the United States Supreme Court. Juries are scrutinized based by this standard. Now, let me tell you about a juror that was known as DB, who was questioned before being impaneled as a juror in the Scott Eizember trial and sentencing phase. This, in the documents, the juror goes by the name DB. Now, let me read to you a couple of responses that DB gave. DB was asked on a jury questionnaire. Now, mind you, this is before the trial ever begins, before the sentencing ever begins. Again, the goal is to get a death qualified juror, and for that matter, a life qualified juror, someone who could consider both perspectives, both sentencing options fairly, and someone who could, again, be ready to choose either one, depending on the circumstance. DB on question number 42 in the jury questionnaire says, the question says, have you ever formed an opinion either in favor or of or against the death penalty? If so, please explain. The juror said, yes. I firmly believe if you take a life, you should have yours taken. You should lose yours. What are your feelings? Number 61. What are your feelings about the death penalty? I have no reservations about seeing someone put to death so long as it is proven that the person is guilty, especially if they have taken the lives of others. Which, of course, seems to indicate that that they are interested in the death penalty for crimes other than murder. Right there. So, question 62, what purpose do you think the death penalty serves in our society? The juror says, keeps taxpayers from having to support a criminal for the remainder of their life. Again, this is DB before the trial, who became a juror in the case, in a death penalty case. Question 63. Do you think the death penalty in Oklahoma is used too often or too seldom? It says definitely not too often. 64. Which option best summarizes your general views about capital punishment? She says, or DB says, I am strongly in favor of capital punishment as an appropriate penalty. And I could go on, but it's obvious with these responses. Again, let me refresh your memory really quickly. DB said, I firmly believe if you take a life, you should have yours taken. I see no reservations about seeing someone put to death as long as they're guilty. I think that the death penalty keeps taxpayers from having to support a criminal for the remainder of their life, and says that they are strongly in favor of capital punishment as an appropriate penalty. She furthermore says, if I feel like guilt has been proven, I would not hesitate to impose the death penalty. There were three sentencing options at Scott Eizember's trial: death, life without parole, and life without the possibility of, death, life without parole, and life with the possibility of parole. The juror has to be able to consider all three. Obviously, from DB's responses, they are very much inclined to the death penalty. Those responses reveal a bias before the trial ever began. Before DB was ever impaneled as a juror, DB had biases about the death penalty, about who should receive the death penalty. Biases that made them biased against Scott Eizember before the penalty phase ever happened. So there were some other options, and I wanted to quickly elaborate on some of these. During question and answer, Scott Eizember's attorney asked if DB would be able to consider a life sentence. She said yes, if the death penalty wasn't an option. And then she said, if they're in prison for the remainder of their life without the possibility of parole, why not just the death penalty? As if the death penalty is the logical conclusion for all of these questions. She says, DB says, he or she says that they would be inclined to choose the death penalty if the death penalty is an option. All of this is in Scott Eizember's appeal to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals a number of years ago. So it's important to point out that, while Scott Eizember might be guilty of a number of crimes, death sentences are supposed to be decided by juries that can that exist with a certain degree of impartiality, that who are able to fairly choose between death, life without parole. Now, of course, there could be other options, but what I'm trying to say is they should be able to show impartiality when looking at the range of options. There is no question from what I've just shared that DB was inclined to give the death penalty. That is illegal. That is unconstitutional. And it is wrong. You see, Scott Eizember has a number of things in his past, number of mitigating circumstances that should have, received a lot more attention and consideration. But a juror like DB was already ready to go. They wanted the death penalty. You see, it seems to me that DB wanted the death penalty from the moment that DB walked into the jury room. The DB wanted to see Scott Eizember to be executed. You can think all day that Scott Eizember is a monster and he deserves to die, and you're entitled to that opinion. But in this country, we are governed by law. And the law states that Eizember is entitled to impartiality when it comes to sentencing. And it is clear from the jury questionnaire and the jury interactions that DB had that DB was not impartial in the slightest. Again, it seems like DB was ready to choose death from the moment that DB got on the jury, or perhaps even the moment that DB came into the jury room. My friend Scott Eizember, spiritual advisee Scott Eizember, is scheduled to be executed on January the 12th, 2023. In my mind, I can't help but think that DB got what DB wanted. Or perhaps a better way of saying that, it seems that DB is going to get what DB wanted. These sentencing processes, again, should be defined by impartiality, not partiality. DB was partial to the death penalty. The process through which Scott Eizember received the death penalty is immoral, it is wrong. While certainly I believe that the death penalty is wrong, executions are wrong, no matter what, this process, even if you're going to have a death penalty, is immoral because it didn't follow the law. It didn't create a space of impartiality. I hope that in this moment, you will take a second to ponder the case of Scott Eizember and think about what you can do to make sure that we do not execute a man. We do not execute Scott Eizember based on a faulty process. There will be opportunities in the coming days to sign petitions and to push back, to call the governor in Oklahoma. But it seems to me that partiality should never define our criminal justice system. It sure as hell shouldn't define who we execute.